Hello, good afternoon, or good afternoon in Singapore anyway, and welcome to the Global Centre for Public Service Excellence. My name is Max Everest Phillips. I'm director here, and I'm here with all our colleagues, and we are delighted to welcome Ryan Orange, the Deputy State Services Commissioner from New Zealand, to address us in another of our webinar series on public service reform. It's a huge pleasure to have had Ryan's company and intellectual input at the Centre for the last few weeks, where he has been a Thinker-Practitioner in residence, helping us to develop our ideas around motivation and the importance of motivation for effective public service. Ryan, a few years ago, coined the phrase new public passion as an extension of the idea, or perhaps a pastiche of the idea, of new public management, which itself 20-odd years ago came out of New Zealand. It's therefore a great pleasure to have Ryan with us today to elaborate a little bit on the importance of motivation for making reform happen. This is based on Ryan's experiences at the State Services Commission in New Zealand, but also a very extensive experience working in Australia and elsewhere, and most recently making a visit on behalf of the Centre to look at the state of public services and public service in Papua New Guinea and the role of motivation in that, and the requirements for reform in Papua New Guinea. So, Ryan, without further ado, can I ask you please to address us on the subject of making reform happen, new public passion?
Thank you, Max. It's a great pleasure to be here, and welcome to everyone I can't see out there in the virtual world. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about a subject that I know I can talk about for hours. So I've decided I'm going to try and speak slowly but move quickly in terms of taking you through some thoughts about why I believe, and why I've been drawing off the thinking of the United Nations Development Programme Centre for Public Centre Excellence here, that motivation is absolutely critical to sustainable reform. And as Max said, that I'm drawing very heavily on my experience of working on and leading reform in New Zealand for the last 5 years, but also the opportunity I've had leading reform in New Zealand to interact with a great range of jurisdictions from around the world, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, but also in the Asia and the Pacific, both through my connections with the Centre, but because a lot of jurisdictions are interested in what New Zealand is doing, for better or for worse, and make the trek to Wellington to come and talk to us about what they're trying to achieve and what we're trying to achieve. So for me, the last 5 years has been a very intense experience of trying to make change in New Zealand, but also a very interesting one of engaging with a lot of other jurisdictions about the change they're trying to make. All right. So what I'm going to try and cover in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the essential goal and challenge. And I'm going to skate over that pretty quickly because I'm assuming here that I'm largely preaching to the converted, but if you want to pull me up on it later, that's fine. So that's the idea that public services are critical to the quality of life, and if you're trying to achieve things like the Sustainable Development Goals, you have to get them in place effectively if you're going to have a chance of doing so. But also that the context in which civil services are working is changing. Change is accelerating, the world is complex, and the circumstances we're operating in financially, in terms of people's morale, are not necessarily optimal for driving rapid change. And in that context, we have a certain toolkit that we've relied on, and that toolkit is changing and being developed. And the idea of new public passion is a contribution to that discourse, a contribution to trying to think about how we can change our public management models to better suit the environment we find ourselves in. So for me, I'm going to bring that idea in combination with my experience, talk a little bit about how I think you can achieve sustainable reform. And my final question there is, what does this mean for you? Now, obviously, I can't answer that for people at the moment, but I will draw on a couple of examples to try and make that real. On one hand, my experience in New Zealand, and on the other hand, my very fresh experience of going to Papua New Guinea with the centre and engaging with some of the leaders who are trying to think about civil service reform there. All right. So the slide is just trying to get into that initial idea about the importance of civil service reform. I ended up working on civil service reform coming from an academic background in international relations and intervention in civil war, because I thought that was the biggest problem, and I thought sending in humanitarian forces to stop civil wars was the best solution. The more I worked on that, the more I found that I was drawn towards civil services and civil society and the role of civil services in building civil society as the thing that struck me as perhaps the single most controllable factor for a government in terms of the quality of life of their citizens. And just taking this slide here, which references my experiences in Papua New Guinea a couple of weeks ago, there are a range of things that the government and certainly the civil service of Papua New Guinea can't control. They can't control the weather, and Papua New Guinea has been experiencing a severe drought. They can mitigate drought through effective civil services, but they can't control the weather. They can't control global prices, and Papua New Guinea is the country in the world that is most exposed to shifts in global resource prices, and were hit last year by a very significant drop in liquefied natural gas prices, which hit their budget very hard, and they can't control that. Again, they can mitigate it if they use effective systems, and they can't control for the great strengths and challenging diversity of their culture. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, the way that the Wontok culture sets some boundaries around where you can rapidly change and how you will achieve it. But I think they can control within those constraints the effectiveness of their public services. And Papua New Guinea is a country that hasn't been successful in achieving any of its Millennium Development Goals. So if it's going to achieve its Sustainable Development Goals, I think getting its public services into a better place is an absolutely critical platform for going there. As I said, I hope I'm largely preaching to the converted in terms of that. But the environment we've found ourselves working on civil services and civil service reform is one of change. And here I've been particularly inspired by my time in Singapore and the thinking of Peter Ho in particular, the previous head of the civil service here, but also Jocelyn Burgon and her work on the new public synthesis. But they draw off a rich dialogue in the world at the moment about globalization, about interconnectedness, about the changes in the ways that people communicate and connect, and the idea that in an increasingly complex and interconnected world, you get an increase in fragmentation where diverse sources of authority and points of decision-making proliferate, but also an interdependence where the decisions in one space are influenced by decisions in another. And more than ever, no country is an island, and no one's individual decisions are made in isolation. And as things become more connected, but also more fragmented, you get a rise of unpredictability and rapid change, where patterns seem to arise out of a vast array of interactions and seemingly out of nowhere. So we think about that in terms of the environment. We also think about it in terms of the global economy. But I see it every day in terms of the civil service environment, the reality that for my day job in New Zealand, change is more rapid. I mean, it's obvious on my desktop, or the fact that I'm even doing a webinar for the first time, which is, a tangible example of an interconnected world and me having to adjust to a changing environment. But it affects everything that we do. And so this has been the driving force, I think, of recent thinking about public management systems, which I would tend to categorize under the general heading of new public governance, is thinking about how we take our public management systems and make them work in this interconnected and unpredictable world. But of course, if you want to achieve rapid change, you want to be able to respond to this environment, it would be great if we were operating from an optimal platform. But of course, for many public management systems at the moment, for many civil services, they find themselves in a space where money is scarce and morale is low. And I've chosen here just to pick the first paragraph of a editorial or an opinion piece that Max recently had published in the Straits Times here in Singapore. And the critical observation there, on one hand, is that when you look at OECD countries, 58% of them are undertaking strict austerity measures, which is a pretty clear measure of the scarcity of money, but also that morale isn't just being affected in countries with the obvious impact of fiscal austerity, it's being affected in non-austerity countries as well. And the Centre's been doing a bunch of great work, and hopefully you've had the opportunity to look at some of the Centre's material around what's driving some of those issues with morale and how motivation and understanding motivation is critical to overcoming that. So in that context, as I said, we've been looking to the thinking around new public governance to help us to think differently. And so my experience of reform in New Zealand has been quite heavily driven by this sort of progressive development of public management thinking. New Zealand's very proud of its public administration background. We passed our first State Sector Act in 1912. We've had more than 100 years of politically neutral merit-based appointment in our system, and it's no accident that as a result we're #1 on Transparency International's comparative ratings on perceptions of corruption and fairness. And New Zealand is also famous for coming along and implanting new public management over the top of that when we found that our system couldn't respond to the environment that we were in, that it wasn't driving accountability effectively, and that our public service wasn't as responsive to government or the people as we wished it to be. We turned to new public management, and the essential idea there that if you borrowed from the private sector and brought in very strong accountability and incentives to deliver, that would improve performance. And New Zealand's actually done very well off the back of that. We have highly effective, highly efficient agencies that are very responsive at delivering to ministerial needs within our 3-year electoral cycles. But what we've found, and I'll come back to this in the example, is that that's not so great for delivering across agency boundaries on the really pressing issues that we're struggling to deal with in an environment of change and complexity. So obvious examples, things like dealing with high needs families with kids who are growing up in poor conditions, struggling with their access to health and education and justice, to a stable working environment. And the reality is you can't respond to these needs of families without working effectively across agency silos and without effective citizen engagement. So our reform has been very centred around new public governance. But I came at this issue of new public passion and trying to look deeper into motivation because I was doing reform and I wasn't paying much attention to it. I've been quite driven by the literature and by the current thinking and by my experience of going out into the world and looking at other jurisdictions, but found that I was underestimating the importance of motivation in that process. So I'll come back around to that in a moment in a practical way. But briefly, what is the idea of new public passion? It's an idea under development, but it centres around the belief that motivation really matters. It matters as much as the primary tools that I tend to look at when looking at public sector reform. It stems from a general observation that our public management systems over-rely on extrinsic motivation. The ideas of new public management have been quite persuasive and pervasive. You'll often look at managerial solutions in environments where people aren't paying a lot of attention to how they can trigger intrinsic motivation, but believing that to get there. Whereas I actually think it's fairly obvious that high levels of intrinsic motivation advantage. Many people feel the calling of public service and come to the public service because of their intrinsic motivation. So if we're not harnessing that natural advantage we can, and if you can follow the logic, we need to harness intrinsic motivation to enable the dynamic and adaptive public servants we need to respond to increasing change and complexity. As things become more challenging, we in fact need people to be more adaptive. And I think that intrinsic motivation sits at the heart of that. And ultimately, that reform itself is not sustainable if you don't understand and design around the motivation of public servants. Now, as I said, I know I'm whipping along, but really briefly in terms of some of the origins of that idea and some of the ideas we were playing around with here at the centre that helped to drive my thinking around this. An oldie but a goodie is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I start there because I think that incentives and accountability can get you up the hierarchy all the way to esteem, but they fall short of genuine self-actualization. The idea of self-actualization is actually very centered on intrinsic motivation and the fact that you can look within to find the adaptability and responsiveness that enables optimum performance and can get you to the top of that hierarchy of needs. And that sort of idea is permeated into someone like Gary Hamel. Now, Gary Hamel is a renowned international business thinker, and he focuses on the private sector, and his 2007 book, The Future of Management, focuses on the idea that we need to reinvent management to deliver innovation because we've got to get away from hierarchy to community of purpose, and that is driven by passion. It's driven by people's intrinsic motivation, your ability to tap into it, and his view is that engagement as a critical driver of performance in private sector organisations is driven by passion, creativity, and initiative. And it's not that you can't do things with diligence and obedience, but that in a rapidly changing marketplace, you can't hope to do them really well. And the same idea you'll find in Daniel Pink's Motivation 3.0, the idea that we're shifting from a primary focus on the extrinsic drives of reward and punishment and carrot and stick towards autonomy, mastery, and purpose as ways of really driving performance. So off the back of that, what I've been doing is bringing together that thinking and my practical experience of reform to try and think about how you can drive reform. Now, just to be really clear, I'm not for a moment suggesting that you throw out all the tools of the past and only use intrinsic motivation. I say that from practical experience. I've tried it. I'm a very passionate person. And to be honest, relying on intrinsic motivation alone is a recipe for burnout and non-sustainability of change. The single passionate leader can throw themselves willfully against the system, but in reality, if you're not harnessing professionalism, accountability, and modern dynamic networks, motivation alone is not going to get you there. But it is a critical element of what you need to bring to bear to make reform work. So I'm going to whip through this really quickly because I want to talk about the practical examples. And in some ways, all I'm talking to here is the fundamentals of change management. Reform is effective change management put into place. You need to diagnose, you need to understand what the specific problem is that you're trying to deal with. You need to capture the reform moment. And this is the idea that there are some environments that are more conducive to the sort of transformative change of reform, the sort of occasion where you need to break the system in some way before you can change it, as compared to ongoing continuous change, which systems should be doing all of the time. I've found in my key lesson of reform from my last 5 years of experience of trying to do system reform is that focus is incredibly important. Figuring out what you can change and what you can't change at that moment of reform, and not squandering your energy on the things that you can't change while focusing really tightly on the things that you can. And I believe that motivation is a critical determinant in terms of understanding where your focus can be used effectively and how you're going to harness the motivation that is there to generate change and build the momentum for getting towards your destination. Because any reform is only going to be a step along a pathway towards your ultimate destination. And I think increasingly what the new public governance thinking is showing us is that your destination has got to contain dynamism. that trust is critical. Responsiveness is what a public service is there to do, to respond to decision makers and citizens. But if you don't have dynamism, you can't sustain trust and responsiveness in a modern complex environment. I'm going to skip over 1 to 5 down the bottom, and I'm going to come back to them on the New Zealand example in just a moment. The idea that you need to pick a few things and get your ducks lined up in order to drive change. All right, just a couple more minutes, but I want to work through a couple of examples before opening this up to questions. I don't know what this means for you. That's for you to think about. But I have a significant degree of experience about what it means for New Zealand, and I'm starting to help do some thinking about what it might mean for Papua New Guinea. So in terms of New Zealand, now again, this is something I could talk about for hours, and I'm very happy to get into questions around it. But in rapid time, the diagnosis in New Zealand was that we had poor outcomes on complex cross-agency issues. I've already talked about that, and that was the central issue in our system. And we saw that because we had some outlier results. We had things that we were really good at and some things that on OECD comparative basis, for instance, we did fairly badly at, and were outliers compared to our other results, and most of them were things that fell into that complex cross-agency environment in terms of our ability to bring multiple parties together to collaborate on those issues. We had a reform moment. It was driven by a recognition of the increasing need for change, by the impact of the global financial crisis and the need for financial constraint, which could have been used to drive towards austerity, but which fortunately used instead to drive towards changing the way that we think. A maturity where New Zealand had done its last major reform 25 years ago, so people had sort of got that we needed change, and critically a champion, particularly our Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister, Minister English, who had lived through austerity reform and saw a different way of doing reform and has been a great champion of change. We focused on a number of things. I can't hope to cover all of them under these themes of results and stewardship and system leadership. But in a moment, the thing I'm going to primarily focus on is the results as the centerpiece of reform and why they spoke to and captured motivation in a fortuitous way, to be honest, because that wasn't what we were thinking about, but why we didn't capture their full benefit in terms of the overall scope of reform over the last 5 years. And in terms of destination, briefly for New Zealand, this again is where motivation comes in, intrinsic motivation, because the big issue in New Zealand is trying to push towards highly empowered, integrated frontline decision making. The last 5 years of reform have actually been pretty successful in New Zealand. We've done quite comprehensive enabling reform, where we've changed all the legislation, we've changed all the rules, we've brought the leaders together at the top of the system. But that's only a step towards getting to the place where many of the pressing social issues in New Zealand need frontline workers who are empowered decision makers, not running compliance processes. And ultimately getting there is about that self-actualization and dynamism in terms of public servants who can tap into their internal motivation to be really effective frontline workers. So again, on the New Zealand reforms, just briefly around results, is the Better Public Services results. All of this stuff is up on the website, State Services Commission website in New Zealand. But when I think about the results, the critical thing about them, and there were 10 Better Public Services results identified by the Prime Minister, and the critical thing about them were that they weren't comprehensive. It didn't matter too much which ones you picked, but they needed to be really important. There needed to only be a few of them. You needed to commit really publicly about them, and you needed to assign clear public-facing responsibility without all of the levers. So what that meant in our system is we picked some results, like improving outcomes for vulnerable kids through the specific lenses of reducing rheumatic fever, reducing violence against children, improving early childhood education, and improving vaccination as an example of a cluster of results. And we said one minister is responsible and one chief executive is responsible, even though you don't hold all of the levers. And you have to bring to bear the capability in the system to make this change. Now, it's another whole story how we did that. But the point that I want to draw out of this here is what worked about that was being really focused and finding the point in the system that connected your ability to think about your trust, your accountability, your networks, and your motivation. And the results worked really well for that. What didn't work so well, and this is just as important, is I spent a lot of time in my system For about 2.5 years of the reform, I expended about 50% of my energy on things I couldn't change. We spent a lot of time blaming ministers without getting our heads around the fact that that was context we couldn't move on. We spent a lot of time thinking about grand structural solutions and comprehensive frameworks without understanding the complexity of the environment and the degree to which we were not going to be able to implement them. And even if we did, they wouldn't work because we wouldn't be able to drive them with the sufficient focus to make them stick. And we critically underestimated change management and thinking about middle management and the frontline motivation from the start. The reality is that we did a reform of new public management, trying to shift towards new public governance, but we did it with a new public management mindset, one that fundamentally looked to extrinsic motivational levers to try and drive change. So we started at the top, we drove down through the leaders, we put in place legislative change and altered incentives. And as I said, these things are incredibly important. I'd do all of them again, but I would do other things as well. And I would go right back to the start of that process. Or maybe I'll not go back forces time to do this again, because it's inevitable that we'll have to do this again at some point in time, and I hope to be involved. And at that point in time, I'd hope to invest a great deal more in understanding the motivation of our public servants down inside our system and designing our change around their needs, as well as our chief executive's needs and our minister's needs and our primary decision makers' needs. And I mean, this may seem like a simple and small thing to say, but when asked in a session on this a few weeks ago what I'd do differently, one of the things I said is I'd make more speeches. I gave a speech on these issues to chief executives very early in the process and was ridiculed. Maybe that's too strong, but dismissed for being irrelevant. And that doesn't happen anymore because we've shifted a great deal with that group of leaders. But as a result, I didn't go out and do any public speaking about this for 2 years and missed a massive window of opportunity for connecting with our public servants about why this mattered for them and what they needed to do to change. Now, that may seem like an incredibly obvious statement, but I make it because it's a mistake we've made, and it's a mistake I've seen many jurisdictions make through not really understanding intrinsic motivation and focusing too much on extrinsic motivation. And I'm going to have to be incredibly brief on Papua New Guinea, but the thing that really struck me in terms of being there was in many ways how obvious it was that to break the sort of cycle of challenge that Papua New Guinea is in, they cannot simply rely on extrinsic motivation and the sort of changes they've been making, good changes they've been making around accountability for key results. They're really, really going to have to find a way of tapping into the intrinsic motivation of their civil servants and breaking the cycles that they currently have around politicization, fragmentation, the lack of a strong national idea to galvanize around, leading to low expectations of service poor implementation and apathy inside their system, in a context in which there are some things that they can't and shouldn't even attempt to change around their cultural context, which means that when they look to their reform moment now, the chance 18 months out from elections as Papua New Guinea states its place in the world, as they prepare for the big challenge of hosting APEC, as they try and capture the champion spirit that they have in some of their leaders of reform and focus on how they create a virtuous cycle around leadership, they're really going to have to tap into intrinsic motivation to build their ability to restore political and public trust. I'm going to stop there. I really want to keep going. I want to keep arguing and explaining myself and digging deeper into that subject. But I think I've sort of skated over the top of it, but put it in the context of some practical change. And would now like to throw it out to people here in Singapore and people out around the world on the net to talk about this idea.
Thank you very much. Ryan, thank you very much indeed. That was a very motivating and thoughtful presentation. Everyone was being motivated at the beginning. I think by the end were, and I'm sure people are motivated also to ask some questions and have a little bit of discussion about this. Are there any questions that we can put to Ryan? I'll hand over to Aunt.
Yes, I have the pleasure of asking the first question. I was wondering whether you could share some insights on how you got stakeholders outside the civil service involved in the reform process. You reflected a bit on what you would be doing differently in managing the reform process internally by getting more people involved at the lower ranks of civil service. What was your experience in generating motivation by engaging your key clients, the citizens and businesses of New Zealand?
Thanks, Ant. I think that's a really good question. And the immediate answer is we didn't do a good job of engaging stakeholders. I'll come around to some good news after I've given you the bad news. And when I think about why we didn't do a good job of engaging stakeholders, the reason initially was secrecy. There's a tendency to think about civil service reform as about structures and jobs and institutional frameworks. And increasingly my experience tells me that that's a part of the puzzle, but it's actually not the major part of the puzzle. So when we started on the reform journey in New Zealand, all of our papers, and in fact the very existence of the team that I was working on, was a secret because we were preparing papers for the Prime Minister and they weren't open to general discourse. Now I can tell you now without breaching any of my provisions under my secrecy clearance in New Zealand that nothing we did in that work was secret. It was all exactly the sort of thing you want to take out to people and engage with them, because actually saying to people, we want our civil service to be more dynamic, we want to change the way it can work effectively and the way that it can drive collaboration, is exactly the sort of thing you should have a public discourse on. This had a cascading effect in our system. It meant that we started from a position of secrecy and we very slowly expanded the circle of need to know over the first 18 months or so of the reform. We put a report out into the public domain, but it meant we came late to engaging stakeholders. Ultimately, that got turned around by the experience of the results themselves. So the 10 Prime Minister's Better Public Services results and some of the other reforms around functional leadership meant that on particular issues, groups of agencies had to engage with the community to be able to shift any of those results and to have any hope of hitting their targets. But to be honest, that would have been a much more effective engagement if we had started the entire discourse of reform in the public domain, and that when people came out about those results, that conversation was grounded in a really clear public discourse about why change was needed, not just an engagement around that particular result. And I think, as you sort of pointed out, that all of that creates this cycle about how you're looking at motivation and how you're motivating people to engage in and sustain your reform. And I think the New Zealand reform's on a very good track now, but I think there was a really dangerous period about 2.5 years into our reform where we had great ideas and great buy-in right at the very senior levels of government, but the whole thing could have fallen over very quickly because of a lack of broader-based buy-in.
Ryan, thank you for your presentation and the comments so far. You mentioned high levels of intrinsic motivation as an advantage that the civil service has. My question has a practical slant. So what can an existing civil service commission, for example, do to improve the intrinsic motivation in the service? What are some levers that you think could be pulled, buttons that could be pressed to help?
That is a good question. So I'll have to go and answer it in short form. And I'm going to pick on two different categories. I'm going to say that again because I was muted when I started talking. What I was saying, if you could see me moving my hands, was that Nigel's question is a big question, and I'm going to have a go at answering pieces of it by talking to two specific issues. One is around what I'd call the hygiene factors, the basics, the things that matter everywhere to everyone, whether you're public servants or not public servants. And I'm going to concede that they are really important for getting things right, and you have to do that in your context. But then I'll also talk briefly to the things I think you can do that are more about unleashing passion. And yeah, I think you need both. You have to, there's something there about Maslow's hierarchy, if you like. You need to be able to deal with the things right at the bottom of the hierarchy, and you have to have a sufficient base, because otherwise people can't see their way through to passion. But you also can't build the entire pyramid from the bottom up and get everything right before you start trying to get into that inspirational space, otherwise you won't get for the momentum for reform. So briefly in terms of the bottom of the pyramid, because this will be things that people are very familiar with. It really matters that you get your pay right. Now that's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do. So on one level, if you operate in a system where your basic level of pay for civil servants is so low that they can't hope to have a sustainable quality of life without supplementing their income through corrupt practices, then your system is not well positioned for success. On the other hand, this is where intrinsic motivation really matters, because many civil services in the world can't hope to pay their public servants what they'd really like to pay them, which means that you have to balance out the extrinsic motivation of effective base pay with the intrinsic motivation of looking to why have people come into the civil service and why do they keep coming to work every day in an environment which might not be rewarding them in the way that other roles might. Obviously, alongside pay, you have to get your human resources environment right. And I mean, look, this is an endless topic, but basically I'll say fairness. And fairness is the thing that really disrupts systems, a perception of unfair treatment, a perception that others are being treated differently to you, and a lack of sufficient transparency in a system for people to understand it. And that comes in different forms all over the place, but you can walk into a jurisdiction and immediately know if they have their house in order in that sort of way because of the way people talk to you and the way that people behave. Look, that list could go on because there are a range of core things that you can work on, and there's a lot of work going on in that space. But because I don't want my answer to get too long, I'm going to flip to the other side and talk about the passion and belonging. And I might take the example of Singapore here. I'm sitting in Singapore. I've had the good fortune of being able to come to Singapore off and on over the last 5 years because I found them very inspirational around reform. And one of the things that Singapore has done right in its remarkable story of change over 50 years of independence is it's focused on getting those base things right and really getting them right in terms of the extrinsic motivators. But it is also focused very heavily on the idea of its civil service and the importance of its civil service and the connection of the civil service as an engine of change in terms of its overall society. So things like the fact that Singapore has had public service 21 for the 21st century, operating since the 1990s on the same platform that the idea of how civil service needs to change and respond to society, they've had that in place 20 years before most jurisdictions have started to do that. Now that's obviously a contextual comment. Singapore isn't the world's best example of transparency, and as a result some of their citizen engagement is quite narrow and trammeled by what they are and aren't willing to talk about. But why I think it's a really good example is you don't have to have all of your system conditions perfect to be able to actually invest in driving passion for public service into your public servants and into the environment in which you're operating. Again, I'm tempted to keep going, but I'm going to stop so there's time for another question.
We have a question from Shakil Ahmed in Pakistan, UNDP in Pakistan. So what I'm going to do is open Shakil's mic and have him ask the question. Shakil, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. Just a very, because sitting here in a developing country, I was just wondering whether you have observed any difference in the kind of drivers of intrinsic motivation, especially in your experience of working in New Zealand and with PNG. And my second question is that, I mean, it's very easy to say that, intrinsic motivation is so important. But, the way to kind of create that intrinsic motivation is, to me, is very difficult. I mean, like in extrinsic motivation, you can increase salaries, you can provide incentives, but it's more of like people management. It's encouraging people to work more. And in my own experience, what I have seen is that there are people who are by, I mean, sometimes I see that by nature they're so lazy. I mean, like people who come to office and they just look at the clock and they just want to finish up the day and go back. At times it's very difficult to kind of work with those people, and consider a government which is so big, where you are talking about thousands of people. So I was just wondering whether how to kind of create that kind of intrinsic motivation, which really requires kind of working with people directly and kind of creating something which is more of like working with them directly.
Thank you, Shakil. Ryan, you got the question?
What a great question. And I am going to have a go at answering it, but to be honest, if I had the absolute answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here in this office in Singapore. I'd be out directly consulting to the government of Pakistan and having them pay me great deals of money in order to motivate all their public servants. But genuinely, I will have a go. And I've got three thoughts in response to that. One is to your point about it being really easy to say, and I agree, and I've actually been trying to write some material for the centre, and sometimes I find myself accusing myself of peddling a truism. It's obvious that intrinsic motivation matters. Of course, how you feel about something determines whether you do a good job of it or not. But how I pull myself back from that is I look back at my experience, and I look at my practical experience of reform and how little attention I paid to intrinsic motivation, and how little attention the literature that I use to help me think that through paid to intrinsic motivation, and how easy it is to take it completely for granted and let it drop off the table. So in many ways what I'm after, because new public governance has intrinsic motivation built into its thinking, but is to really highlight it so that people don't take it for granted and don't make the mistakes that I've made. So that's one observation. The second one is about the difference. This question about difference between jurisdictions, and New Zealand is a little bit of a special case in terms of intrinsic motivation and the degree to which the spirit of public service is very burnt into the hearts and souls of our public servants, if you like. But that, of course, isn't an accident. That's a product of 100 years plus of public management design, and of having people think about that and building a system that ingrained that over time. And so the connection there, which I've got to get to your third question about how you can make the difference, but the connection there is, I think, particularly the one between trust and intrinsic motivation, and the degree to which having an environment in which people trust that things will happen, that they can make a difference, that integrity will be sustained, not all of the time, but enough to give them that sense of momentum, is critical for unleashing intrinsic motivation. And that tends to be the single biggest variable I see when I look at jurisdictions in terms of how easy or how hard it is to tap into the intrinsic motivation. So that's simply coming back around to my argument before, that these things are interconnected, and you have to go back to the core of your public administration. You can't just do motivation in isolation. Coming around to your example, and look, that's a great blunt way of putting it. There are really lazy people, and there are really lazy people who will just come in and look at the clock, and particularly if you're working in a public service that doesn't have strong extrinsic motivation levers, doesn't have performance management that works effectively, can't remove people from their posts if they're doing a bad job, then not having those effective extrinsic levers is really constraining in terms of your ability to drive performance. And again, I'm not saying that you don't need them, but where this applies for me and why it particularly connects to reform for me is that if I'm in that sort of environment, or any environment actually, it applies to New Zealand as well, and I'm trying to capture a reform moment in order to drive change. Every system has lazy people who sit and turn up and look at the computer all day or play cards or don't even come to the office. And the reality is no reform is going to capture their imagination and turn them around. It's how you capture the imagination of the critical mass of people that you need who do have intrinsic motivation, and how you turn them into champions of your reform, and how you enable them to work effectively inside your system that is critical to driving change. As I said, that's not a new idea, it's basic change management, but it connects this lever between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and really talks to me about the way and the challenge that I'm afraid is unique to every setting. So we'd have to get into the specifics of it. But in terms of tapping into those who will be there in every system, who have the intrinsic motivation, and enabling them to be the drivers of the change. Again, I want to keep going because it sounds too glib, but it's the platform through which I think you can have a discussion about how you can tailor your change to make your reform sustainable.
Shakil, does that answer your question?
Yes, very useful. In fact, I would, I mean, even in my own capacity as a manager of a unit, I've been looking into these issues, and I'm also doing a kind of a very small experimentation, which I haven't shared with my staff here, but something I'm also doing on those things, and would be sharing with you some of the outcomes of that later on.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the Singapore team. Ant, if you'd like to ask a question now.
Yes, I wanted to ask Ryan to reflect a bit more on what is a reform moment. I think especially in relation to UNDP's support to countries that are basically in dire need of reform, but that are looking for the moment at which they might have an opportunity to make a real difference. And you obviously you would have your experience from New Zealand to reflect on, but maybe you can imagine also what it might be in the development context.
Thank you, Ant. And I've flipped my slides over to the Papua New Guinea reform moment slide because that has very much been the experience of late, that it's really been driving my thinking around this. When the centre said they were going to send me to Papua New Guinea, I found that quite daunting, because when I looked at the literature, at the information on my computer, on Google, on the media, the reform moment wasn't obvious to me. And so in that sense, what is the trigger that is going to enable things to be different than they've been before? With no disrespect to the incredible people who have tried incredibly hard in Papua New Guinea to shift things in very difficult conditions, Papua New Guinea hasn't hit its Millennium Development Goals in an environment in which there's been a relative resource boom and their economy has been driving relatively well. So if you've had 10 years of boom and haven't been able to get the change, why in this more complex and difficult environment they're in now are you going to get reform? And on the first day I was in Papua New Guinea, all the meetings I went to just confirmed that. I heard about all the problems, the politicization, the fragmentation, the low expectations of service, the shifting of money into places where politicians rather than public servants were deciding on the delivery of services, a whole range of compounding issues, which by the end of the day gave me a big headache. Because there were so many interconnected complex barriers to shifting. My experience tells me that you need a reform moment to engage in change. That is, if you simply, in that situation, the World Bank marches in and says, you must do this and this and this, and you simply implement them, it usually doesn't stick. And if you can't find that trigger that says, this is why it's going to be different, it's really important. The other thing that's on our mind, I've heard from the centre who are working with Malawi a little bit at the moment and hoping to work with them a little bit more, that Malawi has had 87 identifiable attempts at reform in the last 20 years. And I haven't looked at that at all, but my strong instinct on that is that if you don't recognize what your reform moment looks like and tailor your reform to that moment, you have a strong potential for being trapped in a perpetual of form that doesn't stick. So in Papua New Guinea, what happened was that over a few days of meetings, you found strands of activity that were going on, critically strands of activity that were not being connected on the ground, that when you brought them together started to really create a picture of change. So one of them was about the degree to which, while there was real political challenge, there was more political stability than there had been for a while. But there were also elections coming up. So there was an incentive for people to want to be taking action now, 18 months out from election. Even more than that, people got excited when they talked about last year's Pacific Games and how well it had gone in a way that they didn't talk about most of their other work. And people talked about the fact that they've got APEC coming in 2018, which is a natural challenge for collaborating across agencies in order to deliver, which is clearly something Papua New Guinea is not ideally positioned to do, with very fragmented departments who didn't talk to each other. And there was a range of work going on about leadership capability, but it was going on in different places that weren't connected up. And so you had a series of champions who were singing from the same, but didn't actually really know that that was what they were doing. And when I brought together those things, by the end of the 3 days, I was really excited. I was really excited about the degree to which there was a potential reform moment. Now, reform moments are only potential. All of that could pass by and nothing could happen. In fact, with fragmentation, it's a likely outcome. But if Papua New Guinea is able to connect those things and bring it together and connect it to a trigger, maybe like the work they're doing around APEC, and then build leadership momentum and create a virtuous cycle, that might be the sort of reform moment that they can capture in order to drive change.
Thank you very much for that. Can I now ask Max to give a vote of thanks and bring this webinar to a conclusion?
The Sustainable Development Goals, as we all know, are now live, and for the next 15 years are setting the development agenda. And we know that at least 11 of the 17 development goals depend primarily on effective public service for their implementation. And what I think we also are aware of is that the importance of public service is taken for granted. And I think, therefore, the very inspiring and, dare I say it, motivating the passion that Ryan Orange, Deputy State Services Commissioner from New Zealand, has given us on the importance of looking at the intrinsic motivation for delivering the Sustainable Development Goals is really important. I think there's an unacknowledged crisis in many ways in facing the development goals, whether they will really be achieved unless the problems that Ryan has outlined for us so well this afternoon are properly addressed. So on behalf of the Centre and everyone listening and participating, can I thank you, Ryan, very much indeed for a very powerful, passionate and also important presentation. Some key points and ones that I think the Centre will continue to push as critical for achieving sustainable development over the next 15 years. Ryan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Max, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for joining, everyone, and we hope you'll join us for our forthcoming webinars as well.